As we've been saying, Monday marks the 50th anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the most famous shipwreck on the Great Lakes. The massive iron ore freighter going down in a November storm on Lake Superior. The wreck immortalized in a hit song by Gordon Lightfoot. The exact cause of the wreck still being debated, and a new perspective is offered in this new book, Wrecked: The Edmund Fitzgerald and the Sinking of the American Economy. It's co-authored by Lawrence University professor Gerald Poder and a familiar face in Northeast Wisconsin. And we welcome in Tom Nelson, the co-author of this book, and of course you know him as the Outagamie County Executive, which leads right to the first question here, Tom. How does a county executive become the author of a book about the most famous shipwreck on the Great Lakes?
Well, I guess the long and the short of it is some people like to put together model train sets. I like to write books. So my interest in the Fitzgerald is a story that a lot of people in Wisconsin have, which is you heard the song. And also, in my case, I went up to the Valley Camp Museum in Sault Ste. Marie when I was about 7 or 8 years old, visited the Fitzgerald display, and as a 7-year-old who is about 4 feet tall, maybe, going up next to the lifeboat and how its hull was just ripped apart. It looked like this angry shark that was staring at you. So it was an image that has stayed with me a long time. And in my public service, I've taken an interest in economic development, labor studies, and so forth. And so I wanted to approach this book from a different angle. And that was looking at its larger historical significance, and specifically how the Edmund Fitzgerald was a vehicle that literally and figuratively carried the U.S. economy in the 1960s and the 1970s. It had a direct connection here in Wisconsin, not just because many crew members were from Wisconsin, but the Fitzgerald, which brought ore from Minnesota, Canada, down to Ohio to be made into steel, to be made into ships, cars in Detroit, paper mills here in the Fox Valley in Green Bay. The Fitzgerald touched, the members had everything to do, the crew members had everything to do with our livelihood.
All right, it is a new angle to a story that has been told and retold, like you mentioned there. There are many theories as to why this ship sank. I'm wondering if you add any new information comes to light in your book that kind of adds to that discussion or debate.
Well, I learned a lot, and I conducted several interviews and research that had never been done before. And so with these interviews and talking to people who had a direct connection to the Fitzgerald, I learned what I think was the strongest compelling reason behind why it sunk. And that was the Edmund Fitzgerald was not seaworthy. It should never have been on the lake on November 9th and 10th of 1975. It was ill-maintained. It passed inspection despite the fact that it was in terrible shape. It had been carrying loads 10, 20% beyond what it was certified. And it turned out that I learned that Fitzgerald was an example of a bad boss, where the company's not making enough investments in the plant, taking care of the workers. That's also some new information I brought up, which was kind of curious because this story is 50 years old. And I was talking to family members that had never been interviewed before. I spoke with attorneys for some of the family members that had not done interviews either. And so because these were first-time interviews, I got a lot of really rich research and artifacts that really, I think, made a very strong argument behind what I think the reason why it sank.
Tom, there are records of the Fitz breaking records for how much iron ore it could carry. Obviously, it was the largest one built at the time, but does that speak to that 10 to 20% overcapacity you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. And so the famous song by Gordon Lightfoot, there's a line that talked about how it ran 26,000 long tons more than it lay empty. And so it was certified to do 26,000 tons, but there were times in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where it was carrying loads up to 30,000 long tons. And so you're talking over 20%. Now, if you do that once or twice, okay. But when you're doing that day in and day out, year in and year out, that does a lot of damage to the ship. And indeed, in my research, there was a gentleman who conducted a federal deposition. I talked to the attorney, where what I call the 30th crew member, who was not on the last voyage, but he knew the ship inside and out because he had sailed on it for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And his testimony in this deposition showed that the ship was falling apart, that the keel itself was tack welded. Okay, it was literally patched together, and of course, underneath the keel is the hull and then the lake. And so you can see that the body itself was wearing out. It wasn't maintained. The original design was not great, and so these factors kind of conspired together to ultimately lead to the ship's demise on November 10th, 1975.
Tom, yesterday I spoke with a family member of one of the crew that went down, Deb Champeau. She was 17 years old when her dad died. 50 years after it happened, she tells me she's at peace with why. In her words, only God and the 29 men on board that ship know exactly what happened on November 10th. And it upsets her that there are people that still want to go down and investigate to come up with a conclusive answer, because it would be disturbing a gravesite, which under Canadian law is absolutely illegal. There are massive fines for this. So my question is, did you speak with some of these family members about those types of concerns, and what did you hear in response?
Yeah, in fact, I talked to Deb for about an hour, and she's been one of the most heavily involved family members with the legacy of the Fitzgerald, and she was instrumental in raising the bell back in 1995 and passing the Canadian law that makes sure that people don't dive it. And I'm glad to hear that she's at rest or at peace with this, because we had a very good conversation. It kind of seemed like there were some things that were still affecting her. She actually makes up a pretty big part of one of my chapters. So that was a very enjoyable conversation. I spoke with about 5 other family members, actually closer to about a dozen, just because some people just didn't want to go on the record. But these are people that have lived very hard lives. This has been with them. They've been reminded of it, and it's been very, very difficult. And I can't imagine that this now is going to be quite emotional for them because it's the 50th anniversary.
No question about that. Well, Tom, thanks so much for this, and congratulations on the book. Good luck with it.
Thank you.